Okay. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our April 1st presentation by Ariana Makau of Nzilani Glass Conservation for Oakland Heritage Alliance. Preserving the past, planning for the future, saving a 118-year-old glass dome in Oakland. So Nzilani Glass Conservation was established in 2003 by Ariana Makau, a Kenyan-American who both lives and works in Oakland. Ariana holds an MA in stained glass conservation from the Royal College of Art in London. Nzilani is a highly specialized stained glass company dedicated to making the profession more equitable by being accessible to underserved communities. What started as a small one-woman studio has expanded to include a full-time crew of glaziers, artists, project managers, and interns. If you do have questions during the presentation, please feel free to post them in the chat. At the end of the presentation, I'll read off the questions for Ariana to answer. And to access the chat, there should be a chat icon at the bottom of your screen. So if we just click that, you can enter your questions there. So without further ado, I hand things off to Ariana. Thanks for presenting to Oakland Heritage Alliance.
Thank you for having me and asking. First of all, I want to start this off with a question for everyone out there in the ether. That way I can temper my talk to my audience. If you can put in your chat, wherever your chat is, if you know, if you have experience with stained glass. So I guess it's just a yes or no or a Y or an N. If you have worked with stained glass before, that would be helpful. And I'll just take a few minutes as more people are coming in. So it seems like it's more no than yes. Awesome. So I'm happy to share with everyone. And if you do know about it, then it'll just be a refresher. So without further ado, let's go. If I can get there we go. So just to give you orientation of this dome, and then I'll give you some history, but this is what we'll be referencing. And when I say the dome is actually comprised of 12 different panels. So I'm going to be using my little arrow here a lot. This didactic diagram on the left explains how the panels go together. So every line here is a different panel, and it corresponds to these pieces over here on the right. So I always do this as sort of an overview of what we're going to be talking about. So we'll talk about the historic context of the building. This is really interesting in that it was a church, it was going to be a retail building, and then it went back to a church. So that's pretty unusual for a building. And then identifying the structural and stability issues of this unique piece. Health and safety, because Nzilani is really serious about health and safety. In fact, our motto is be safe, have fun, do excellent work. And safety literally comes first, because we feel if you're not safe, you can't have fun, and you certainly can't do excellent work. And then finally, we're going to be talking about how this project for me was really exciting outside of just the context of a stained glass conservator, in that it brought together a lot of other artisans and people who liked historic buildings, all working together to preserve this amazing dome. So first, the historic context, which I'm sure will be interesting to everyone here. It started off as the First Church of Christ Scientist. Here you can see some historic photos that we got. And I'm actually just going to read from every project that we do a treatment report like this. And this one was for this dome, so it's pretty thick. And it's for instances like this, so I don't mess up. I have all my reference material here. So I'm just going to read from here that the First Church of Christ Scientist was originally formed on October 16th, 1895, as a brand of their mother church in Boston, Massachusetts. The original congregants were followers of Bostonian church leader Mary Baker Eddy, and were sent to California in the mid 1890s to begin a Christian Scientist branch in the West. Sorry. The lot at 1701 Franklin Street was originally purchased for $8,000, and the cornerstone was laid on May 1st, 1900. It took 2 years to build the church, with dedications and first services held on January 5th, 1902. The church, which was constructed in the Romanesque revival style with large, rough stone blocks with sunk joints, was designed by architect and church member Henry A. Schultz. And Mr. Schultz was a one-time partner of the noted Bay Area architect Arthur Page Brown, who designed the historic San Francisco Ferry Building. The stained glass dome was designed by Charles Grohl in 1902 and was constructed by the firm of Flanagan and Bedevig of Chicago, Illinois. Installed below the skylight of the church, which we'll be looking at in a minute, its 12 panels and multicolored dome underwent at least one partial preservation, in quotes, restoration treatment before we worked on it, but hadn't been completely conserved until we looked at it. And then in 2015 to 2019, it was owned by Jeremy Kitson of Jeremy's Department Store. And I think there might be some people in the audience who can talk more about this interim time of the building. And his plan was to refurbish the interior in order to make it a department store. So he leveled the floor, took out the organ, and also took out two, here you can see they're kind of boarded up here. They're two figurative stained glass windows, which I can happily report were delivered by Nzilani about 3 weeks ago to the First Church Christ in their new, well, actually, we took them out. We looked at their new location, and they're currently at Nzilani for conservation purposes, and then they'll get those panels back. And then this is where we came in. Resurrection Church, which is a relatively young church, which used to congregate in the Hub on Broadway in downtown Oakland, was looking for a church and came across this location. It was up for sale again, and they purchased it with an anonymous donor. And we were called in to look at actually the two images you see on your left, the triptych of the way, the truth, and the light, because they wanted different iconography for their church. And you can see Armel LaRue here, who is our studio head, and this is myself, looking up at the dome. Let's see, I'll take that off. Looking up at the dome, and these three windows are over here. And when we were in this space, we always say this when we're in a historic building, can we look on the top part? And this is Res Oak as it is now. So just a reminder, this is how it's comprised. And this was our first visit. So one of the first things that was really interesting to us is normally domes are made up this way, and this dome was like a giant salad bowl. So we were curious about how it was set up from the top. So Armel and I looked at, it came through the attic. It was actually quite glorious and palatial for us. Usually we're crawling on our hands and knees through an attic. And here you can see the skylight that was installed before, which provides light for the dome. And then this is the original hardware for the lights. And then every other light is an IKEA light that was hanging and plugged into the side, but not functioning. So there's a pretty sturdy catwalk, but underneath there's plaster lath. So if any tools or anything fell through that, it would go right through the ceiling. And as we got closer, we got really curious, and we're wondering about, well, we still can't see the stained glass dome. Why can't we see it? And it was underneath this plexiglass cover. And this is when things got really interesting. Because underneath this plexiglass cover, we saw there was evidence of an earlier leak. And if we go back here just for a second, you can see in my hands, there's a leak, like tide marks from water on this one piece. So obviously someone had put this there. And then after that, there was still ongoing leakage. And so we assumed that was the reason for the cover. And then there's this clear plastic sheeting. How was it supported? It had this aluminum bar that was holding up the sheeting that had been sort of loosely caulked in. And then it was sitting on these 1x2 wood pieces with knots in them that were starting to fail. You can see there's water damage here. And then the center was the most worrying because the whole center part of the dome cover, this protective covering, was sitting on the dome. So it was adding more weight to support the cover. And we already had established that something was happening to it because there were repairs on it. Additional things that we found were that there were panels that were out of plane. This is a steel support that is holding, if we think back to that circle with the lines, those lines correspond to the steel part. And then you see, if you follow this one panel here, it sort of kicks up. So it's sitting up, and the old repairs were excess amounts of silicone just put there so the light wouldn't show through, but it wasn't really treating the panels at all. And then these steel supports here, which are original, we think, sat on top of the T-bar, and then the panels were tied on with, these are called tie bars with steel ties, but some of them were ripping off. You can see here it was separating off. So it wasn't really providing that much support. And so also with these bars, the panels were sort of concertina-ing apart. And I also draw your attention to this glass here, which is this beautiful textured green and white ripple glass that was just sort of set around the corner here with no anchor points. In some areas it was there, some areas it wasn't. We couldn't quite figure out why that was there because it wasn't illuminated at all. So the bars, we realized that someone had tried, as we looked a little bit more from underneath, that the bars were not supporting from above. So someone came in a previous campaign and added extra bars from underneath, which makes sense because you're trying to support it from underneath as well as the top as it's starting to sag. But again, there were issues with these support bars. Normally, the bars should notch, which is why these are cut, and engage with the steel frame. In this case, they were cut too short and were just hanging here. So now they're adding more weight to the panels and not providing any support to the panels. So they were sagging down even more. And they also didn't really correspond to the design of the panel at all. So here's some tide mark, water damage, more bars, and they don't really line up with anything. We also noticed the glass was separating. So you could see this is called a light leak, which means that the glass isn't supported at all. Here's an old repair where someone just put black silicone because in the daylight, when light's coming through, the black reads as a lead line. There are some in situ repairs which weren't very sympathetic. And then over here, you can see this glass piece was just held in by a little silicone at the tip, but that's one of these Starfire pieces coming out. And so this could have fallen down at any time. I should also state that the dome itself is 10 feet in diameter and was 25 feet off the ground. So the other thing that was really interesting to us and also very concerning was that once we took off the support, we found why probably there was so much damage. The whole steel frame is literally hanging on. So it's a steel frame hanging up into the attic. And then there's this extra weight. So we worked with a structural engineer who gave us specs. And then I said, double them, because I don't ever want this thing falling down on anybody. And what should we do? So this is how it was set up before. There's this twisted steel cable, which goes through an original steel tab, goes back up, and then is nailed in a very unusual cockamamie way. Sometimes they would just spin the steel around here, and these are freestanding screws that are holding in. And then also, if you're looking top down, that's what this view is, and a couple other photos. And then it was hanging off of these bars or drilled through the joists in the attic, and there was deterioration. So all very worrying. So no one panics throughout the rest of the talk. This is what we did, so it didn't fall down. This is Sean, a rigger who worked with us, and here's how we over-engineered supporting the frame. And one of the other challenges that we had after we had the specs from the engineer was, you'll see in a couple photos later, is that the steel frame was hanging, as I stated, and it was hanging about 1 inch over a beautiful plaster filigree design by about 1 inch. And so there was no way to lower the steel frame to treat it on the ground. It all had to be treated in situ after the panels were removed. And we only had 1 inch of clearance. So if you took off the supportive one to replace it with the new part, it would tilt a little bit. So you had to make sure none of the plaster was engaged during that work. But Sean was excellent and nothing happened. So then we started site work. This was after all of our assessment. We worked with a scaffolding company that we love. We work with all the time. They work in historic buildings. Their first question always out of the gate is, can we tie into the building, or do we need outriggers? How much do we need to protect the building? Which was lovely. So they built us this scaffolding, and you can still see the dome here. At the last part, we attached it to the ceiling just with tape so it wouldn't affect that plaster lath, because we're dealing with lead oxide. So in order to make sure that we were safe and we separated our work from everyone else who was in the church, we built this containment unit. And here you can see a detail of that filigree. So then we got to removing the dome, and this is me working from above, working with the team underneath. So the scaffolding had to be built in a unique way, again, because we're dealing with a dome that's like a giant bowl. So it was higher on the sides and then lower in the bottom. And then we had planks that we could move around. And what I was doing here was scoring all this old silicone repair in order to release the panel, which was still very fragile, and then work with this team to lower it down. So we fed everything down through. And this was the worst of it, the center where there was just large flops of silicone. We took advantage of the panels being out to treat the frame as well. So we cleared all of it, any rust or damage. It was relatively sturdy. It just had a thin layer that we cleaned off during the containment time. And then we repainted it to consolidate everything. And then every other panel had a T-bar that was loose. So we took that into the studio to take the frame. Just a reminder what they look like. Then they were in the studio. So normally when you're rebuilding a stained glass window that's flat, you just work on a workbench. In this case, the panels are curved. So we had to build concave and convex benches or cradles to do the work. Sometimes companies will build them flat and then bend them in place, but we believe that it makes more sense to build them in the complex curve that they are supposed to be in at the end, because there's less strain, and that means the life of the panels will be longer. So here we are working with Al Wengard, who is sort of our patron saint. He works in the same building as us, and he's a master carpenter, and we use his shop, and we also use his know-how of over 80 years of amazing knowledge. So here we are scratching our heads, figuring out how to do the complex curve, and then these are the cradles. As we were working on the cradles, we also documented everything because we're conservators. So every panel had a rubbing done of it, where we would document where the rebars were, where there was damage. Here you can see there's a detail of this area and then what the corresponding rubbing looked like. So here is, there's missing here, lead distorted, indicating in situ repair. So we go down to this detail, and that's what ends up in this book, because after the panels go back up, it's very hard to access them. And also we want to have a record of what happened before. Again, this is a before and after. We also have a photography studio where we can take photos. The next step was dismantling underwater. Again, a nod to safety. We have a filtration system in the studio. So once we dismantle underwater, we don't have to wear full Tyvek suits. We can filter everything. Underwater, it goes through a multi-system water filtration system. The final stage is a resin exchange. So when our water goes back into just out the effluent water, we're not adding lead and other heavy metals into Oakland's water system. And then we had to clean every single piece of glass. Then, as we were cleaning them, we noted anything that was damaged. So we don't replace unless something is missing or it's extremely fragile. All of these pieces that have blue tape on them, we adhered with Hextol. So we were able to keep the original glass. Here's an example of some of the pieces we re-adhered, either a straight crack or we would do fills. And this was very, very exciting to us because this is residue of silver stain, silver nitrate, which means this literally is a stained glass dome. These bevels, the three-dimensional pieces, have silver stain, and they're stained halfway through, which is what gives that bright golden glow. So here you can see, and here's more. This red glass was very fragile and problematic, but we were able to keep it because the color was just so hard to match. And we of course wanted to keep all of the original. The next stage, we have multiple studios, but this is where we build because we have fume hoods. So we're able to solder and the fumes go straight out. The rubbings that we did are basically 1-to-1 to scale, and that's what we use to build. And again, these cradles are used. You can see here, this is Jenna building, and here's one that was already built. So they're being built in that cradle, and there's some pretty serious consideration for the end of the lead points. It's somewhat out of focus here, but you can see this point has a little bit of glass showing here, and it's because we wanted the points, it's called a false point, but it gives a really nice end to those more floral decorative areas. And sometimes you'll see if a window has been rebuilt by someone who doesn't understand that technique, you lose all that Victorian detail and it just becomes this round curve. The next step is soldering. So we have to solder every single joint and then carefully take the panel and turn it over and solder every single joint. And then this is the least glamorous and the most important part of building a window, especially if it doesn't have any protection. So this is called putting or cementing. And basically you take this combination, which traditionally is calcium carbonate and some colorant and linseed oil or fish oil, and it's brushed over the whole piece of the whole panel. And in this case, because everything is so fragile, it's finger puttied. So you have to push it underneath very gently to not break or re-break the glass. And again, it's done on both sides. And then we use horsehair brushes to slightly and gently polish that. And again, all of this is done on the cradle. So every single piece of glass is supported in the position that we want it to be done. So we did a lot of hem and hawing about how we wanted to support this dome, because traditionally conservation is like for like. So if you're redoing something, you want to replace the bars where they were before. But obviously these bars were failing, and some bars had been added later. And in conversation with the structural engineer, we came to the conclusion that basically we're dealing with a giant salad bowl and we want to put it in a colander. And so we worked with architectural metalsmiths who, again, were working off of that complex curve to make interlocking steel support bars. And they did this beautiful job and came and fitted them on every single panel. And basically it's these giant steel hands holding the dome in, and all of these are long enough so they engage with the steel frame. So they're really holding all of those panels. And then we also added these extra horizontal support so the panels just couldn't fall apart. Then they dried for a little bit. So we put them on these custom foam supports. And then the cradles were converted to support bars in order to get them back up to the structure. So all along the way, we had these cradles that we built them on, then cradle support travel mechanisms, and then we use them to lift up. So the whole time, these panels were very carefully taken care of. Final part, we're very happy because it took us a long time and this was just such a lovely project. We put the panels back in, and it was sort of the reverse of that. Again, you can see here the very small clearance between the steel frame and the filigree. So each panel would go in and the steel frame would tip, and then you'd put in the next one, and it was a balancing act. And we set the panels in with a little bit of foam support. And you can see here, instead of putting that really large, copious amount of silicone, because we had the luxury of the skylight above, which was just part of the roof, we didn't have to think about the dome protecting inside from weather. And so conservation has a mantra: wherever possible, you want to have your technique be reversible if you come up with another idea in 50, 100 years. And also, God forbid, if something happened to one of these panels, we wanted to easily be able to remove them without interacting with the other panels. So these are sitting here with a few clips here, which just have a daub of silicone on them, and rubber shims as an interface with the metal. So everything is very soft and gentle, holding them in. And then the final step was putting on a plastic cover, because we always want our clients to be able to take care of their pieces on their own. As much as we love and become very enamored and intimate with the pieces that we work on, we move on to the next one, and we want to have our clients know as much as possible about their own pieces and enable them to do just normal maintenance. So this is a custom plastic cover, which you can see goes around the hardware system. But if there is future water damage, they can take that up themselves, or they can call us up if no one wants to deal with the heights and clean this off or replace it, rather than having to deal with something that's, days and days of construction to remove it. The other thing is, this puts absolutely no pressure on the dome whatsoever. So that's removing that ongoing pressure that the other design had. These are a few final beauty shots of the dome. This again is it before the protective glazing. And we chose to leave the lighting in there because of the phases of what the church was at. They had a really quick turnaround for getting this done. And unfortunately, they opened and then a few, or had their first service rather, and then a few weeks later, COVID hit. So they've been closed for most of the time since it was installed. But the next phase will be addressing a sensible lighting system. Here's another view of it from the balcony. It's kind of hard to tell, but all of this is, all the steel frame is painted. You can see all of these bars were lengthened out, and then we asked our metalsmiths to hammer the last bit. So instead of cutting the metal and making it half the size, it's actually hammered, so it has a larger footprint and actually engages with the steel frame even more. So this is my favorite part. I would love to answer any and all questions. If I don't know, I will tell you I don't know, and maybe someone else in the chat will know. But if it's about the whole structure and timing, I'm ready and willing to answer questions. So Daniel, hopefully you've been watching those chats.
Yes, for sure. Thank you so much for the talk. This is really inspiring, and thinking about all the little pieces, especially the safety aspects. There's so much to think about when, that goes into historic structures.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of questions that I saw in the chat. One clarifying question that was answered, but just to clarify for other people, someone asked, or Chris Peoples asked, where is the building exactly?
Oh, right. It's on the corner of Franklin and 17th in downtown Oakland. And
Cool.
when things open back up, the church is a very welcoming welcoming church, and they're very eager to have people come in and see all the work that has been done. Great,
thank you. Christina had a question. Can you give us a ballpark of what the budget is for this project, if that's able to be shared?
It's not able to be shared. I would love to tell you. I can tell you it wasn't cheap, and I can tell you in general, the work that Nzilani does is not. It's, in my opinion, the best or one of the best works, because we take care of all the health and safety aspects, because we do a lot of documentation, because we do a lot of interaction with our clients and bring them along. One of the things I really don't want to do, and I don't want to emulate, which is what some studios do, is take an object, put it behind, like the Wizard of Oz, put it behind the curtain and then say, ta-da, look what we did. Aren't we amazing? You could never do what we do. We really want to pull the curtain back and show you what we do. And that takes a lot of time. And obviously you can see through all the different steps that we did, which I could give you a 5-hour talk. I love talking about what we do. It's very, very labor intensive. And I don't think robots are ever going to be able to do what we do. And there's those split second, or not split second, there's those artistic interpretations of, do I want this lid to go this way, or do I want this other one to go around, or what was the past artist trying to do? So, all of that takes time. And fortunately or unfortunately, that time has a price tag.
Thank you. Yeah, it seems like it's almost an art in itself to interpret what was the intention back then.
Yeah.
Cool. Neil has a question. Can you tell us more about why some of the glass was more fragile than others? You mentioned the red glass in particular.
Right. Well, different glass colors have different components in them. They're called network modifiers, if you're going into the the molecular structure, and there's been some debate recently, is glass really a liquid, is it not a liquid? But broadly speaking, some glass is probably, it just wasn't annealed as well as other glass. So I think that red glass, it's very untechnical, but as soon as I felt it, and our studio head, who has the same or maybe a little bit more years of experience under her belt, so collectively we've got 50 plus years working with it, it felt crispy. It was very kind of, I'm trying to think of something that comparable in normal life. It was almost like rock candy. It kind of looked like that on the sides. And so you would adhere one crack and then another crack would happen. And so the debate with that was, first and foremost, and this is something that I really find engaging and interesting with stained glass in an architectural structure, is at the end of the day, it has to function as a window. And so if you did a beautiful job, but water is streaming into the home, and your client is standing in a foot full of water, they don't care how beautiful the window looks. They care that they're standing in a bucket of water. And so our concern in this is, it's really hard to access. It's over where the congregation is. Were we okay with putting that glass back in the situation? And what we actually ended up doing was almost, if you think of butterfly band-aids, how they go across, let's say this was the crack. Normally we would put the epoxy here, and if it dripped to either side, we would clean it up. So the epoxy would just go on the line. But with the red glass, it has a lot of the surface, it has a lot of texture in it. So the epoxy, by its own nature, would sort of seep over to either side. So what we ended up having is these tiny little bridges of support along that crack. And that seemed to give it enough support that we could use it.
Cool, thank you. We have a question from Mark about the lighting system that you anticipate installing, or how does the light get through the glass? Is it natural or from the sun?
So the light that you see in this photo right now is just sunlight. There's no artificial light. And it's really lovely because it changes throughout the day. And we're at the early stages now of working with the church to figure out what they want as a lighting system. And it's pretty difficult, frankly, for a dome, because if you put a lighting system over it, then it gets no natural light. So where do you, and if you have something that's up high, then is that going to cast a shadow while the natural light is coming through? So we're still sort of playing with ideas as to what the final decision will be for that.
Cool, thank you. From Naomi, we have a question. What did you find out about those green pieces of glass around the edge?
Good question. Our thought was that the green glass actually sits here behind these pieces. So, and these go all the way through. So our thought was maybe it was just a really subtle color influence. It was like a very opulent dome at the time, and they just put them there because they were basically stacked up. Like, there'd be a section here, and then a whole bunch stacked up here, and then none here, and then all stacked up over here. So we took them all out. We took advantage of the fact that we weren't over these dome pieces when we were there. We took them to the studio. We cleaned all of them and put them in a crate, and they're up in the attic, and the church is going to decide what to do. But we didn't really know, there wasn't a precedent for them having to be there, and they weren't like exactly the right height. But we felt it was important that they go back to the church when and if someone found either written or illustrative documentation as to where they were supposed to go, but they don't match any of, it's not like they were glass stock that someone threw there, because it doesn't match any of these other windows either. So it's just kind of a conundrum.
Thank you. We have one question from Anne Marie. How much did the dome weigh? Do you have any idea of the weight?
Let's see. I don't remember offhand. Let me see if we have the calculations off of this. It looks like they were working off of 1,000 pounds, so that I think we calculated around 800, but we put it up to 1,000, so we would over engineer it, and it was coming off of 8 different anchor points. That's why these are good, because then you don't have to remember everything in your head.
Cool. I think the next question was answered previously about the cost of the work. Neil had another question. Were the cradles two-sided? That is a concave curved nest for the dome one way, and then a convex curve for when you flipped.
Right,
the
great
work?
question.
Okay.
Yeah, and I can also, should I go back
Sure.
and look at them? Let me see if I might have to, I don't think I can escape. Why are my arrows not working? Maybe I can't go back. There we go. I will start talking as we find those. There's one. Woo. Okay, I'm just not going to touch anymore. There we go. No, and the reason for that is that in order to build, you have to hammer, you put your pieces of glass in and then you hammer into it. And we didn't want to have holes going through, and that main support also being compromised, flipped back and forth. The other thing is, there's some pretty significant weight that happens when you're hammering and when you're building. And so that curve has to be supported in many ways. So there was no way for us to repurpose both sides. So there was both a concave and a convex. So we had one concave and convex for the 4 panels on the inside, and then we had 2 for the outer rings, because those could be built faster. They were smaller. And the center portions were a little bit more difficult. So we gave those to skilled glazer. Everyone is skilled, but people who had been glazing longer.
Cool. We have a question from Betty Lynn about where do you receive funding from, and maybe more broadly, like, can you give us an overview of maybe some of your different clients? Are they institutions, individuals, companies?
Or where do we get our projects from?
Yeah.
So Nzilani has been in existence for 18 years. I've been doing conservation for about 20. And initially I had thought that my path was going to be working in museums. And so some of the work that we get now, because of my connection with working at the Met and the Getty down south, and many of the San Francisco and Oakland museums here, we have projects that come from museums. So those are funded by the museums. And then our other projects used to be mainly large churches in and around the Bay Area. Since the pandemic, people, as everyone knows, have been at home. And so our interest and outreach has been to residential homes in the last year, because people are spending so much time in their homes. They're noticing that they have windows that are bowing, or windows that have holes, or we had one case this last year when the smoke was really bad. A woman noticed that the smoke was actually infiltrating through every single joint in a gridded window in her office. And she had no idea that they were that leaky beforehand. So we work in residential homes. We also work with the state. We've worked at Point Reyes Lighthouse. That was really fun on the Fresnel lens. And we've worked at Emmanuel Church, which is part of the Marshall Gold State Park up in Colma. And so that's sort of the range of the hands-on projects we do. We also do surveys. So I've done a survey up in Seattle. I'm slated to do one in Buffalo and in Arizona later on this year. So I'll go and I'll do an assessment that is separate from actually doing the work. And of course, we'd love to do the work as well, but we present that as being something that's very separate. So I can also act as a consultant, third party, to go and look at the condition of windows and then help whatever the private owner or institution, help them work with local stained glass companies to make sure they have their health and safety protocols in place, to make sure that they're documenting the windows before they change them. Even if the work was bad before, you at least want to document what it looked like before, because there might be one tiny reference that you won't have later on if you lose it. So those are some of the different projects we do.
Cool, thank you. We have a question from Helen. Did the Oakland Landmarks Board play any role? And maybe more generally, do you work with city preservation bodies when conserving glass?
We would love to. We'd love to have more interaction with any preservation organization. In this case, there had been a lot of back and forth already. And I think there might be people in your group. I thought I saw names, but they were going really fast right before I started, who can speak to that specifically. But one of the reasons that we document everything is because we love that aspect of the work that we do. When we were working at Grace Cathedral, and they had a really large archive of work, but it was in manila boxes and no one knew what was in them, and there was no organization. So one of the other things we really like to do is organize all of that as part of our surveys. And then that becomes a document that anyone can access. It's both printed out and is online. We leave it to the client to share and disseminate the information however they want to, or we get the go ahead from them. And we store it digitally on our archive, so we can share it in the future if people need access to that. One really good example of that was we worked for up in Sausalito, the Marin ship, which actually didn't have that much glass, but I was sort of the GC head conservator, coordinating a whole bunch of conservators. Did some work a couple of years ago, and then I believe it was 5 years later, someone else, they had a turnover of who was working on it, and no one else could find the report. And so they reached back out to us to see if we had a copy. And so we were easy. It was easy for us to disseminate that information back out to them.
Cool. Since we're running a little short on time, I'll try to combine the next couple of questions because they're kind of related. It sounds like your team arrived just in time. Do you have an opinion on the projected life had you not done your work? And maybe in a related sense, how do you know when age has become a problem? How do you know when to sort of give you a call?
Right.
And yeah.
I don't have, I mean, you never know, but these are indicators for us when you should call us or someone else. When a window is bowing or bending, that's a good indicator. Some in very rare times it's intentional, but if you see anything that's bending or it doesn't look like it's bending in a sort of butterfly bookend way, that probably means that it's starting to fail. When you see glass and the lead separating, so I referred to it earlier as a light leak, so you can actually see through or you can poke something through. That's obviously time for something to be looked at. If you look at the solder joints, oh, we just happen to be on one. So every single joint is sort of buttressed up against another one, and then there's solder that goes on top of it. So if you see the line between those two joints at that solder joint breaking, or there's a line of separation, that's a structural failure. If you see a break in the lead where it's not joining, it's in the straight line, that means the lead is failing as well, because that the solder joint might just be a break or a cause of the bowing. If you see white flaking stuff at the bottom rim of your window, that's lead oxide dust. That's another time that you should not take care of that, and you should call in a specialist. I sort of went over it at the beginning, but all of the team is lead worker certified and asbestos certified. So we have the training and also the tools, the PPEs, in order to address toxic substances. And so that's another time to call someone. And if you do, if you have a tiny window and you see that at the bottom, don't clean it up with something dry, spray something wet, and then use a paper towel and fold it in on itself and throw that away. Because the main thing you want to avoid is creating dust in the air and you're inhaling it.
Great, thank you. We'll have just time for one more question. The other questions, I will save them and I'll send them to Ariana, and hopefully we can answer some of these afterwards so that no one's questions got lost. Maybe the last two questions. Earthquakes, we had a few questions about earthquakes and stained glass, and also maybe a good one to close on is what does Nzilani mean?
Oh, sure. Earthquakes, good and bad. I mean, this one is great because now it's just gonna swing slightly and it'll be fine. Windows, I've never heard of a stained glass window falling out completely because of an earthquake. Lead is really malleable, so it's kind of not great because over time it can bend, but it's also great because of that slight movement means that less glass will break. So keep all the stained glass in California, just make sure it's well stabilized. And then Nzilani is, let me see if I can do this fast. Hopefully I won't get cut off. Do you know if I will be at straight 7?
No, we'll be okay.
Okay, so this is a great story and actually means very much a lot more for me to talk about it today. So my father is Kenyan, and in his culture, you're given one name when you're born, so you're not hey you, and then you're given another name when you become who you are in your parents' eyes. So you could be 5, you could be 15, you could be 55. It's really up to your parents. In my case, the day that I received my master's in stained glass conservation from the Royal College of Art, my father took me aside and he said, I think you're ready for your name. I'm giving you the name Nzilani. It's the name of my mother, your grandmother. And I felt very honored to have that name because this was a woman who had raised 10 kids to adulthood in rural Kenya. She never left her country. One of those kids graduated from Oxford. One of those kids got a PhD in education from Berkeley. That was my father. Many of those her other children thrived in their own way. Last count, I have 65 cousins. Who knows how many great grandchildren she had. And I just found out earlier this week that Nzilani passed away, but she was probably by all counts 102, 103 years old. And she knew that even though she'd never left this country, her country of Kenya, she knew that I had named this company after her. She knew that I honored her in that way. And for me, it's really great to to elevate her history and my history together, and also to challenge people to, see what that name is and what does that name mean, and sort of combine all of the histories together of my European training with the name of my Kenyan grandmother. So that's how the name came to be.
Wow, I think that's a beautiful way to end. So thank you for that. That was really moving. Cool to see that the name carries on and the beautiful work that you do. I'll record the other questions. Hopefully we can get them answered. I think there might be some connections with the Unitarian Church. They have some 1890s stained glass there, so maybe there'll be some conversations there.
Yeah.
I will share my screen now just to talk about
Great.
some of our upcoming events. Let's see if I can do that. Share screen. Okay, can everyone see? Cool. So yeah, thank you all for coming, and please support Ariana, connect with her. We'll send out all of her information so you can connect, and if you have any stained glass, it sounds like she would be a good resource to conserve it in the future. Some of our upcoming events on May 6th at 7 p.m. we're going to have a basketball revolution with Paul Brecky Meisner, a look at Oakland's impact on basketball and the NBA. And on May 20th, we're going to look at Borak Smith again with Phil Bellman. He does a great walking tour, and he's going to share a lot of the insights that he gives on his walking tour with us on Zoom. So we're going to look at the Arbor Villa, the history of Borak Smith, and the Mary R. Smith cottages as well. So please join that on Zoom. You can find that information on our website. And then some preservation action items. We want to make sure that our members are aware of a city-sponsored survey regarding
Click on leave.
The responsibility, yeah. You'll get there, Mary Ann, you'll see.
Okay, there we go. We just want to make sure that our members are aware of a city-sponsored survey regarding San Antonio Park. OHA is definitely concerned about a proposal by the city to build a fire station in the park and the precedent of using park lands for other uses. So please definitely engage with that survey. We'll send out that information after the talk. And also please consider an OHA membership or a gift membership or a donation to keep bringing you these programs, our newsletter, and continued advocacy on your behalf for historic and cultural resources in Oakland. So thank you all for joining, and hope to see you at the next event.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was really fun.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ariana. This is really, really cool information. I'm seeing more stained glass in my neighborhood. So.
Oh, good. And I'm happy to answer all those questions that didn't get.
Oh yeah, I will
answered today.
Record those and get those over to you.
Great.
Cool.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Good evening, everyone.
Goodbye.